The message arrived the night before my wedding, not from a stranger or an ex, but from her brother, the one person I thought had always been neutral, always polite, always safely outside our relationship. It was short, deliberate, and timed too well to be accidental. It landed after midnight, when doubts echo louder and there are no distractions left to hide behind. He did not ask how I was feeling. He did not wish me luck. He did not pretend this was casual. He made it clear he had been carrying something for a long time and had finally decided to drop it into my hands when the damage would be unavoidable. He told me I deserved better. He told me to ask her about Vegas. That was all. No explanation. No context. No attempt to soften the blow. Just enough information to detonate everything I thought I knew. Vegas was not a city in our shared history. It was not a place tied to vacations, work trips, or funny stories told over dinner. It had never come up, not once, in years of conversations about our pasts, our mistakes, our boundaries. The absence itself was suspicious. Important places are either celebrated or deliberately buried. Vegas had been buried. I did not sleep after that. I sat in the dark and replayed every detail of the past year. The rushed wedding timeline. The way her family had pushed hard for dates and deposits. The insistence on keeping things simple while still demanding everything be locked in quickly. The moments when conversation stopped the second I entered the room. The strange tension between her and her maid of honor, a woman who smiled too wide and spoke too carefully around me. None of it had seemed significant on its own. Together, it formed a pattern I had ignored because trust is easier than suspicion. By morning, the message had settled into my body like a weight. Not panic. Not anger. Something heavier. The certainty that whatever Vegas was, it was big enough that her own brother had decided I should know, even if it destroyed his relationship with her. People do not betray blood unless the alternative feels worse. The wedding day arrived anyway. Hair appointments. Coordinators. Deliveries. Everyone moving with the kind of cheerful urgency that assumes nothing can go wrong anymore because too much money has already been spent. I moved through it like an outsider, watching people celebrate a future I was no longer sure existed. She was radiant in the way people are when they believe the past has stayed buried. Calm. Confident. Almost relieved. She kissed my cheek, touched my hand, talked about the schedule, the photographer, the weather. She did not ask if I was nervous. She did not ask if anything was wrong. Either she trusted her secrets were safe, or she trusted me not to dig. I waited until there were no witnesses close enough to interfere, but enough proximity that she could not deflect or escape without consequence. I asked about Vegas. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I did not explain why I was asking. I watched her face instead. Her body reacted before her mind could catch up. The stillness was immediate and complete, as if someone had unplugged her. The confidence vanished. The color drained. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed again. Her eyes moved, not to me, but past me, scanning for exits, allies, damage control. The silence stretched, thick and unmistakable. There was no confusion there, no need for clarification. She knew exactly what I meant. That was when I noticed the maid of honor. She had been standing nearby, pretending to adjust something on her phone, pretending not to listen. The moment the word Vegas landed, she went rigid. Her face changed in a way that could not be rehearsed. Fear, not surprise. Guilt, not curiosity. The kind of expression people wear when they realize a timeline they were counting on has just collapsed. She did not speak at first. She looked at my fiancé, waiting. Waiting for a denial. Waiting for a lie that could be supported. Waiting for instructions. None came. My fiancé was still frozen, trapped between pretending nothing happened and knowing that pretending would only make it worse. The maid of honor exhaled, a small sound that carried more meaning than words. Her shoulders dropped. Her eyes avoided mine. When she finally spoke, it was not to defend, explain, or minimize. It was a quiet admission that whatever had happened was never meant to reach me. Not now. Not ever. That single moment told me more than any confession could have. Secrets that are harmless do not require coordination. Innocent mistakes do not demand silence from multiple people. If an entire circle knows something must stay hidden, it is because exposure would change the outcome. I did not ask for details then. I did not demand explanations or timelines. I did not need them yet. What mattered was no longer Vegas itself, but the infrastructure built around keeping it from me. Her brother. Her best friend. The careful management of information. The confidence that I would marry her without ever knowing what I was agreeing to. The wedding was less than an hour away. Guests were already seated. Music was cued. A life was staged and waiting to begin. And yet, in that narrow space between chaos and ceremony, everything had already ended. Not because of one message, but because too many people had decided I did not deserve the truth. I walked away from the conversation without drama, without announcement, without closure. Not because I was finished, but because I understood something essential. Whatever happened in Vegas was only the starting point. The real story was why so many people believed I could be kept in the dark until it was too late. And I was about to find out exactly how deep that decision went. I did not return to the suite where she was getting ready. I did not sit with friends pretending nothing had shifted. I stepped outside the building and let the noise of the city replace the noise in my head. People were arriving with gifts and smiles, unaware that the wedding already existed only on paper. I was no longer concerned with embarrassment or logistics. What mattered was understanding the scale of what had been hidden and how long the deception had been maintained. Her brother answered when I called. He did not pretend confusion. He did not try to pull back the warning. His voice carried the flat exhaustion of someone who had waited too long and finally accepted the consequences. He confirmed that Vegas had happened 2 years earlier, during a so-called girls' trip framed as harmless, impulsive, and disconnected from anything serious. The framing had been deliberate. The truth had been edited before it ever reached me. Vegas was not a single bad night. It was a sequence of decisions. A hotel shared with someone whose name I had heard before but had been told meant nothing. A ceremony that was supposed to be funny, symbolic, forgettable. A legal marriage that was never annulled when it should have been. Not because it was forgotten, but because it was inconvenient. She came back from that trip unchanged on the surface. Same affection. Same plans. Same conversations about our future. What changed was the urgency. Within months, she pushed for engagement. She wanted dates. Deposits. Commitments. She wanted everything official, fast, and irreversible. At the time, I interpreted it as excitement and certainty. Now it was clear it had been containment. Her brother had found out by accident, not confession. Paperwork. A document left where it did not belong. He confronted her privately. She minimized, justified, reframed. She said it was meaningless, that it had been a mistake, that it was already handled. She made him promise silence. She appealed to family loyalty. She framed me as fragile, someone who would overreact, someone who did not need to know something that would only cause pain. The maid of honor had known from the beginning. She had been there. She had signed something as a witness. She had helped construct the narrative that it was a joke, a phase, a non-event. When the annulment deadline passed, she had helped find reasons not to deal with it yet. When months turned into years, she helped bury it deeper. Her loyalty was not to truth, but to preserving an outcome. None of this surprised me anymore. What surprised me was how normal it all sounded to them. No malice. No panic. Just practical reasoning about why deception was easier than honesty. They believed they were protecting something valuable. They never considered that what they were protecting was built on removing my ability to choose. I returned inside because avoiding the aftermath would only delay it. She was sitting alone now, stripped of the earlier confidence, makeup untouched, hands clenched. She already knew I had spoken to him. I could see it in her posture. The calculation had begun. Which version to present? How much to reveal? How to frame it so it sounded survivable? She tried to repackage Vegas as a relevant history that should not outweigh our relationship. She focused on intent rather than facts. She emphasized time past. She insisted nothing about us had been fake. The problem with that argument was not moral, but structural. A marriage, even one entered impulsively, changes legal reality. A secret marriage changes consent. I asked about the paperwork. The annulment. The divorce. She hesitated. That hesitation confirmed everything. The marriage had never been dissolved. It existed quietly, waiting, an unresolved liability attached to my life without my knowledge. The venue coordinator knocked to confirm timing. The sound felt absurd. A schedule built around a fiction. I told them the ceremony would not proceed. I did not offer explanations. I did not owe them any. Her parents arrived next. Confusion turned to anger when they realized the wedding was being stopped by me. They framed it as nerves, cold feet, self-sabotage. They did not know yet. Or maybe they did and believed silence would hold. When I explained, briefly and without embellishment, the room shifted. Shock fractured into defensive outrage. Not at her actions, but at the exposure. They asked why this had to happen now. Why I could not wait. Why I had involved her brother. As if timing was the problem, not the lie. That reaction told me everything about where accountability lived in that family. The guests were told there was a delay. Then a cancellation. Phones came out. Whispers spread. Someone cried loudly. Someone else argued with staff. I stood apart from it, already disconnected. The public embarrassment they feared so deeply felt trivial compared to the private manipulation they had accepted as reasonable. The maid of honor avoided me entirely. Her silence was no longer protective. It was self-preserving. She had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed and knew it. I left the venue without looking back. There was no dramatic exit, no confrontation staged for witnesses. The damage was already done, and I had no interest in performing grief or rage for an audience. That night, alone in a hotel room I had not planned to sleep in, I reviewed documents sent by her brother. Scans. Dates. Names. Proof. Vegas was no longer a concept. It was a legal fact that invalidated everything she had promised me. What hurt most was not the marriage itself. It was the coordination. The months of shared plans. The trust leveraged against me. The assumption that I would accept a truth that arrived too late to matter. By the time the sun came up, the question was no longer whether the wedding was over. That was settled. The real question was how many other decisions about my life had already been made without me. And I was no longer willing to be the last person to know. The morning after the wedding that never happened, messages began arriving before I had fully processed where I was or why the room felt unfamiliar. Some were apologetic. Some were aggressive. Most were attempts to reframe what had happened into something smaller than it was. People do this instinctively when they realize the version of events they were comfortable with is no longer defensible. Her parents reached out first. They wanted to talk, not to understand, but to manage. They proposed private conversations, neutral mediators, time to cool off. They suggested postponement rather than cancellation, as if this were a scheduling issue rather than a breach of reality. Their priority was containment. If the truth could be delayed long enough, maybe it could still be shaped. She followed shortly after. Long messages structured carefully, each paragraph attempting to isolate one aspect of the situation and soften it. She acknowledged poor judgment without acknowledging deception. She framed Vegas as something that had happened to her rather than something she had chosen. She emphasized intention, love, fear of losing me. The pattern was consistent. Responsibility was treated as abstract. Consequences were framed as negotiable. I did not respond immediately. I was no longer interested in reactive conversations that placed me back into a defensive position. Instead, I started calling people whose names appeared repeatedly in documents and timelines. The officiant in Vegas. The hotel. The clerk's office. I needed clarity that did not pass through her interpretation. The marriage was real. It had never been annulled. No paperwork had been filed. No deadlines met. No technicalities that could be exploited to erase it retroactively. It existed quietly, legally binding, and incompatible with the ceremony that had almost taken place. Had the wedding proceeded, it would not have been symbolic. It would have been invalid. I would have entered a marriage with someone already married, a situation that carries legal and financial consequences far beyond embarrassment. That reality shifted something inside me. This was no longer a personal betrayal to be processed emotionally. It was a risk assessment. A deliberate exposure I had not consented to. The romance of reconciliation ended the moment I understood how close I had come to entanglement that would have required courts to untangle. Her brother called again. This time, not with information, but with relief. He said he had expected to be cut off permanently. He said he had gone back and forth for months, weighing loyalty against ethics. He admitted he waited too long because it was easier to hope someone else would fix it. I understood that impulse more than I wanted to. Silence is often disguised as patience. The maid of honor sent a message late that night. Short. Careful. She said she was sorry I found out this way. Not sorry it happened. Not sorry she participated. Just sorry for the timing. That distinction mattered. It confirmed that if the wedding had proceeded, she would have stood beside us, smiled for photos, and said nothing. Friends began choosing sides without being asked. Some framed me as decisive and strong. Others as inflexible and dramatic. A few implied that walking away was proof I did not love her enough. None of them addressed the central fact. Love does not override legality. Trust does not survive coordination. I met with a lawyer 2 days later. Not because I planned to pursue anything immediately, but because information is leverage. The advice was direct. Had the wedding occurred, unraveling it would have been expensive, slow, and public. Assets, even future ones, could have been implicated. Intent would have mattered less than documentation. Ignorance would not have protected me from consequences created by someone else's secrecy. When I relayed that to her, she finally shifted tone. Fear replaced justification. She asked what I wanted. She offered annulment immediately, cooperation, counseling, anything that would keep the door open. She asked for time. She asked for privacy. She asked for patience. What she did not ask was whether I felt safe. That omission told me everything I needed to know about her priorities. Even now, the focus was on preserving a relationship outcome, not repairing the foundation required for one to exist. Her parents attempted one final intervention. They framed it as concern. They warned me about regret, loneliness, starting over. They reminded me of years invested. They implied that walking away would follow me, that people would always wonder what really happened. I told them the truth was already heavy enough without carrying a lie to make others comfortable. By the end of the week, the narrative had escaped containment. Vegas was no longer a whisper. It was a fact circulating through social circles, stripped of nuance, inflated by speculation. I did not try to correct it. Once trust collapses, reputation management becomes irrelevant. What mattered was that the illusion had ended before it became legally binding. The timing was not cruel. It was precise. As the noise faded, clarity replaced adrenaline. I understood that this was not about forgiveness or closure. It was about acknowledging that the version of her I loved existed alongside a version capable of orchestrating long-term deception without flinching. Those two versions could not coexist in my life. And while others were still arguing about what should have happened next, I had already made the only decision that mattered. When the noise finally settled, what remained was not heartbreak in the dramatic sense people expect. There were no scenes, no breakdowns, no longing for explanations that would change the outcome. What remained was something quieter and more permanent, the understanding that the future I had been preparing for had never existed in the form I believed. I returned home and began dismantling plans that no longer applied. Vendors were cancelled. Accounts were separated. Shared documents were archived and stripped of relevance. Each task felt administrative rather than emotional. That was not numbness. It was clarity arriving after prolonged tension. My body had been bracing for something long before my mind caught up. She continued trying, but her efforts shifted once it became clear reconciliation was not on the table. What began as remorse turned into negotiation. What turned into negotiation eventually revealed resentment. She framed my refusal to continue as punishment, as cruelty, as an inability to forgive. That reframing was familiar. It was the same logic that had justified hiding the marriage in the first place. If my reaction could be made unreasonable, her actions could remain survivable. I stopped engaging entirely. There was nothing left to clarify. The facts no longer needed interpretation. Silence, in this case, was not avoidance. It was boundary enforcement. Her circle fractured quickly once there was no longer a shared goal to protect. People who had stayed quiet began distancing themselves. Others reached out privately to say they had suspected something was off but had chosen not to interfere. That pattern repeated often enough to become predictable. When deception is normalized within a group, discomfort becomes something everyone learns to manage individually rather than confront collectively. I did not feel vindicated by that. I felt confirmed. The legal marriage in Vegas was dissolved quietly weeks later, not out of urgency to repair us, but because it had finally become inconvenient to ignore. The timing mattered. It had not been urgent when my consent was at stake. It became urgent only when consequences were unavoidable. That distinction erased any remaining doubt. I took time away from social spaces that demanded explanation. I did not owe a summary of my reasoning or a defense of my decision. People who needed one were not asking out of concern. They were asking so they could file the story somewhere that felt comfortable. The hardest part was recalibrating my trust in my own judgment. Not because I had missed signs, but because I had interpreted consistency as safety. She had been attentive, affectionate, present. The lie did not look like distance or neglect. It looked like partnership. That realization forced me to accept a difficult truth. Deception does not always announce itself through dysfunction. Sometimes it hides inside stability. That lesson stayed with me longer than anger ever could. Months passed. Life expanded again, slowly and without urgency. I did not rush to replace what I had lost. I did not try to turn the experience into a story with a moral that made it easier to digest. Some things do not need redemption arcs to be meaningful. Some things are simply warnings. Occasionally, someone would mention her name carefully, gauging my reaction. There was none. Not because she had been erased, but because she no longer occupied space that required maintenance. Emotional detachment is not dramatic. It is efficient. I learned later that she struggled with how abruptly everything had ended. She had believed there would be conversations, processing, gradual repair. That belief revealed how she had understood control. She assumed access to my time and emotional labor even after trust collapsed. Losing that access felt, to her, like cruelty. To me, it felt like correction. I never regretted walking away. Not during quiet nights. Not during moments when starting over felt inconvenient. Regret requires believing an alternative would have been safer. I never believed that. The truth is simple, even if people resist it. A relationship that requires coordinated silence to survive is not a relationship. It is a performance sustained by people who benefit from the outcome more than they respect the process. Vegas was not the betrayal. Vegas was the evidence. The betrayal was the collective decision to let me plan a life without full information, confident I would accept whatever truth arrived too late to change anything. They were wrong. The wedding did not happen. The marriage did not begin. The future they planned without me dissolved the moment I understood what had been taken from me. What remained was not loss, but ownership. Of my choices. Of my boundaries. Of a life that would no longer be shaped by someone else's convenience. And that was the ending they never planned for.